Penelope Vance stood in front of her bedroom mirror and did something most women would never do on purpose. She made herself look worse. The faded yellow sweatshirt was 2 sizes too big, the collar stretched from years of washing. Her sweatpants didn't match anything, gray with a small tear near the ankle that she'd never bothered to fix. She pulled her thick dark hair into a messy knot on top of her head, let a few strands fall loose and greasy looking, though they weren't actually dirty, just styled to seem that way. She checked her reflection one more time. Good. She looked exactly like a woman nobody would glance at twice. That was the entire point. "Penelope!" Her father's voice carried up the stairs, sharp with the particular tension he only got before important meetings. "He'll be here any minute. Coffee, now!" She took a breath and headed down. Her father, Silas Vance, ran a business that Penelope had learned, over the years, not to ask too many questions about. He called it logistics consulting. She'd stopped believing that title around the time she turned 20 and noticed the men who visited their house never seemed to carry briefcases, only phones they answered in hushed, clipped tones. Men who looked at her the way a person looks at furniture they're deciding whether to steal. That was 3 years ago. 3 years since the night in Chicago that Penelope had never told her father about, the night she still thought about more often than she wanted to admit. She pushed the memory down and carried the coffee tray into the living room just as the front door opened. The man who walked in didn't look like the others. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision that meant it had been made for his exact body, not bought off a rack. He moved into the room like the room already belonged to him, unhurried, aware of every exit without seeming to check for one. His jaw was sharp, his eyes a pale, unsettling gray, and though he couldn't have been older than his late 20s, something in the way he carried himself made him feel far older than that, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with volume. "Garrison," her father said, standing quickly, extending a hand that Penelope noticed was not quite steady. "Thank you for coming personally." "Silas." The man's voice was low, even. He didn't smile. "Let's talk business." Penelope kept her head down and set the tray on the low table between them, careful to keep her movements clumsy, slightly too slow, the way an awkward, invisible woman would move. She'd practiced this. 3 years of practice, actually, ever since she'd understood exactly what kind of danger came walking through her father's door on a regular basis. Beautiful women in this world got noticed. Noticed women got used, or worse, became leverage. Penelope had decided a long time ago that the safest thing she could be, around men like this, was forgettable. "My daughter," Silas said, almost as an afterthought, gesturing vaguely in her direction. "She helps out around the house." Garrison's eyes moved to her. Penelope kept her gaze fixed on the coffee cup she was pouring, her shoulders curved slightly inward, every part of her performing plainness. She did not look up. She never looked up, not with men like this in the room. But she felt it, the exact moment his attention sharpened. It wasn't the look men usually gave her when they were bored, sliding past her without interest. This was different. This was a man who had gone still, the way a hunting animal goes still right before it moves. She finished pouring and stepped back toward the kitchen doorway, desperate to disappear into the next room the way she always did during these meetings. She made it 3 steps. "Wait!" The single word stopped her cold. Her father shot her a confused glance, clearly unsure why Garrison Blackwood, of all people, would care about the awkward daughter with the coffee tray. Penelope turned, keeping her expression carefully blank, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. Garrison was looking directly at her now, and there was nothing bored in his expression at all. His gaze moved over her face, not her body, not the ugly clothes, just her face, like he was searching for something and had just found it. "Have we met?" he asked. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. "No," Penelope said quickly, too quickly. "I don't think so." He held her gaze a moment longer, long enough that her father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, long enough that Penelope felt her carefully built disguise begin to feel very thin indeed. Then, finally, he looked away, back towards Silas, and said, "Let's discuss the numbers." Penelope didn't wait to hear more. She slipped into the kitchen, pressed her back against the wall beside the doorway, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She told herself it meant nothing. Powerful men like Garrison Blackwood met hundreds of people, faces blurred together for men like that. He probably said things like, "Have we met?" to half the women he encountered, some careless habit, some tactic to unsettle people into talking more than they should. That was all it was. She almost believed it. From the other room, she could hear her father's voice rising and falling in that particular rhythm he used when he was trying too hard to sound confident, and beneath it, Garrison's voice, calm, unbothered, giving away nothing. Penelope closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the cool kitchen wall. She didn't know it yet, standing there in her ugly sweatshirt with her heart hammering against her ribs. But the man sitting in her father's living room had spent 3 years searching every city on the East Coast for a face he'd never quite been able to forget. A face that belonged to a stranger who had once pulled him out of the rain and patched a bullet graze on his arm without asking a single question about who he was or why men had been chasing him. She didn't know that Garrison Blackwood never forgot a face, and she had absolutely no idea that hiding from him had never really been an option at all. Garrison sat in the back of his sedan as it pulled away from the Vance house, one arm resting against the window, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The city lights blurred past in streaks of orange and white. Beside him, his driver, a quiet man named Dennis, who'd worked for him for 6 years, knew better than to speak when his boss went this still. Garrison wasn't thinking about the numbers Silas had rattled off, the property values, the projected returns. He wasn't thinking about the deal at all. He was thinking about Rain. 3 years ago, before he'd taken full control of the syndicate, before his name carried the kind of weight that made grown men stumble over their words, Garrison had been 24 years old and bleeding out in an alley in Chicago. It had started as a routine meeting that went wrong. A rival family, the Kovalenko Group, had decided that the easiest way to stop his rise was to make sure he didn't survive the week. 3 of their men had cornered him near a loading dock at midnight, and what should have been a quick negotiation turned into a blur of fists, and then, worse, a knife. Garrison had gotten away, but not clean. A deep gash tore across his upper arm, and he'd stumbled through back streets in the pouring rain, losing blood faster than he wanted to admit, looking for anywhere that wasn't a hospital, because hospitals asked questions, and questions got back to people who wanted him dead. He remembered the cold first, then the door. It was the side entrance of an apartment building, glass and steel, the kind of security lobby that required a key card he obviously didn't have. He'd collapsed against it more than knocked, and through the fog of blood loss, he remembered a face appearing on the other side of the glass. A young woman, maybe 21, wrapped in an oversized cardigan, her dark hair pulled back in a hurried ponytail, like she'd just gotten home from a late class. She should have called the police. Any sensible person would have called the police, or simply looked away and pretended not to have seen a bleeding stranger outside her door at midnight. Instead, she'd opened it. "You need help," she'd said, not a question, already pulling his good arm over her shoulder to get him inside, out of the rain and away from the street. She hadn't asked what happened. She hadn't asked his name. She'd sat him down in the small tiled lobby, disappeared for 90 seconds, and come back with a first aid kit that looked like it belonged to the building rather than to her personally, along with a folded cotton handkerchief, pale blue, with a small embroidered flower in the corner, clearly something of her own. Her hands had been steady as she cleaned the wound, steadier than his own would have been in that state. She'd pressed the handkerchief hard against the cut to slow the bleeding, wrapped gauze over it with the kind of care that suggested she'd done this before, maybe for a sibling, maybe for herself. "This needs stitches," she'd told him. "Real ones. I can't fix that part." "I'll manage," he'd said, his voice rough. She'd studied him for a long moment, and he remembered thinking, even through the pain, that she didn't look afraid of him. Wary, maybe. Careful. But not afraid, even though a bleeding man showing up outside her building in the middle of the night was reason enough to be terrified. "You're not going to tell me what happened," she'd said. Again, not a question. "No." "Okay." She'd nodded slowly, like that was an acceptable answer, and finished tying off the gauze. "Then don't bleed on my building's floor again. Next time, go to a hospital." He'd almost laughed. It had hurt to laugh. By the time he could stand steadily, backup had finally reached him. 2 of his own men who'd been searching the neighborhood after losing track of him. He turned to thank her properly, to get her name at the very least, but she was already gone. Slipped back through an inner door before he could ask. He never learned her name. He'd gone back to that building twice in the following weeks, once healed enough to walk properly, and both times the front desk staff had no memory of any resident matching her description, or refused to say if they did. Eventually, the syndicate war with the Kovalenko family had consumed every waking hour, and searching for a stranger who'd bandaged his arm and vanished became a luxury he didn't have time for. But he'd kept the handkerchief. Small, blue, embroidered with a flower he still couldn't identify the species of. It sat folded in a drawer in his study, untouched but never thrown away, a reminder of the one person who had ever helped him, expecting absolutely nothing in return. Garrison opened his eyes. The car was idling now, stopped outside his estate gates, and he realized he'd been sitting in silence for the better part of 20 minutes. The girl in the sweatshirt. He'd told himself, walking into Silas's living room, that it was nothing, a passing resemblance. He met hundreds of faces in this line of work, and memory had a way of playing tricks, filling gaps with whatever felt close enough. But it was the eyes that had stopped him cold. The particular shade of brown, dark at the edges, lighter near the center, the same steady calm he remembered from that lobby 3 years ago. The calm of someone who didn't panic, even when everything around them was falling apart. And the way she'd looked at him for that single, unguarded second before catching herself and looking away. Like she'd recognized him too, and immediately wished she hadn't. Garrison sat forward, his mind already working faster than he wanted it to. Silas Vance's daughter. He thought of the oversized sweatshirt, the deliberately messy hair, the clumsy way she'd carried the coffee tray, movements that didn't match the sharp awareness he'd caught flickering behind her eyes for that brief moment. It wasn't clumsiness. It was performance. Someone that careful about looking forgettable was hiding from something. Or someone. Garrison stepped out of the car, already deciding he wasn't finished with the Vance house. Not even close. 2 days after Garrison Blackwood left coffee untouched on the low table and a question hanging in the air that Penelope still hadn't stopped thinking about, she was carrying a stack of folded towels down the hallway toward the linen closet when she heard her father's voice through the crack of his study door. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, that was the honest truth of it, but something in his tone made her stop walking. Silas rarely raised his voice on business calls. He'd learned long ago that calm men got taken seriously, and rattled men got taken advantage of. But right now his voice had an edge to it, tight and fast, the kind of pitch that only came out when he was nervous and trying not to show it. Penelope set the towels down quietly on the hall table and stepped closer to the door. "I'm telling you, Broderick, it'll work," her father was saying. "Blackwood trusts the paperwork. He always does. He doesn't have time to run a full survey on every property before he closes, not with the volume he's moving right now." Penelope's stomach dropped at the name Broderick. She knew that name, vaguely, the way she knew the names of a handful of men her father did business with that he never explained and she never asked about. Broderick Vance, no relation despite the shared last name, ran something on the south side of the city that her father always referred to as the rival operation, always with a slight curl of distaste in his voice, like he considered the man beneath him even while doing business with him. "The deed looks real," Silas continued, My guy in the county office pulled the template straight from an actual filing. Blackwood's lawyers will see the seal, see the signatures, and sign off on it before anyone thinks to actually walk the property. There was a pause. Penelope could hear the tinny, distorted sound of a voice on the other end, though she couldn't make out the words. "Because I need the money, that's why," Silas snapped, his voice dropping lower, angrier now. "You know exactly what I owe, and to who. If this deal doesn't close by the end of the month, I'm not going to be worrying about counterfeit deeds anymore. I'm going to be worrying about staying alive." Penelope's hand went still against the doorframe. She'd known, in the vague way a daughter knows things about a father she loves but doesn't fully understand, that Silas gambled. She'd found receipts before, seen the tension in his shoulders during certain phone calls, noticed the way certain months were tighter than others for no clear reason. She hadn't known it had gotten this bad. She hadn't known he was desperate enough to sell a piece of fake property to a man like Garrison Blackwake, a man who did not strike her, even from one brief meeting, as someone who forgave being cheated. "The Riverside lot isn't even mine to sell," Silas said, and Penelope's breath caught again. "It belongs to the Hendricks estate, tied up in probate for another year at least. Nobody's going to notice it's been sold twice, not until it's far too late and Blackwood's already wired the deposit." Another pause. Whatever Broderick said on the other end made her father laugh, short and humorless. "He won't come after me directly," Silas said, "not over a paperwork dispute. Men like Blackwood settle things quietly. Bad publicity's bad for business, even for him. Worst case, I return the deposit, apologize for an honest mistake, and we're square." Penelope didn't believe that for a second, and from the tightness in her father's own voice, she suspected he didn't fully believe it either. She thought of Garrison's eyes across the coffee table 2 days ago, the stillness in him, the way the entire room seemed to organize itself around wherever he happened to be standing. That was not a man who accepted honest mistakes and walked away quietly. That was a man who noticed everything, who had noticed her, a stranger in an ugly sweatshirt, within 30 seconds of walking through the door. If he caught her father selling him a counterfeit deed for a property that belonged to someone else entirely, an honest apology was not going to be the end of it. She stepped back from the door slowly, her mind already racing ahead of her feet. She should say something. She should walk in right now and tell her father this was insane, that he was gambling with far more than money this time. But she already knew how that conversation would go. Silas would tell her it wasn't her business, that she didn't understand how these deals worked, that he had it handled. He always said he had it handled. He'd said the same thing about the debts 3 years ago, and about the loan before that, and every time the hole had only gotten deeper. Penelope picked the towels back up with hands that weren't quite steady, and continued down the hallway toward the linen closet like nothing had happened, her mind somewhere else entirely. She thought about warning Garrison directly. The idea planted itself and refused to leave, even though every rational part of her recognized how dangerous it was. Approaching a man like that, telling him his associate, her own father, was planning to cheat him, was the kind of thing that could go wrong in more ways than she wanted to count. It could put her father in real danger. It could put her in danger too. But she also thought of Garrison's question in that living room. Have we met? The way his eyes had held hers a beat too long, searching for something she still didn't fully understand. If he was the kind of man who noticed a stranger's face across a room, he was certainly the kind of man who would notice a counterfeit signature on a property deed. The only real question was what he would do once he found out, and whether her father would still be standing when it was over. Penelope closed the linen closet door and stood there a moment longer than necessary, staring at nothing, already knowing, with a heavy, sinking certainty, exactly what she was going to have to do. The Grand Plaza downtown took up most of a city block, its glass front doors flanked by valets in matching gray uniforms, and a lobby that smelled faintly of fresh flowers and expensive coffee. Penelope had never set foot inside it before today, and she felt every bit of that unfamiliarity as she pushed through the revolving door in her oversized sweatshirt, drawing exactly the kind of attention she'd spent 3 years learning to avoid. She'd found Garrison's schedule almost by accident, a torn corner of paper left on her father's desk with a time and location scrawled beside the words, "Be deal, finalize." It hadn't taken much guessing to figure out what that meant. Silas planned to close the counterfeit sale here, today, in this building full of marble floors and hushed conversations, and Penelope had exactly one window before it happened.
She'd written the letter the night before, tearing through 4 drafts before settling on something short enough to be read quickly and clear enough not to be misunderstood. The Riverside deed is fake. The property belongs to the Hendricks estate. My father is desperate and out of options. Please don't hurt him. She'd folded it into a plain white envelope with nothing written on the front, no name, nothing that could be traced back to her if it fell into the wrong hands before reaching Garrison. Now, she stood near the lobby's front desk, heart hammering, scanning every dark suit that passed for the one face she'd been unable to stop thinking about for 2 days. She almost missed him. He came from a side hallway rather than the main entrance, flanked by 2 men who kept a respectful half-step behind him, and he moved through the lobby the same way he'd moved through her father's living room, unhurried, entirely certain of his own space in any room he entered.
Penelope's plan had been simple in her head. Approach quickly, press the envelope into his hand, disappear before anyone thought to stop her. In practice, her feet felt heavier than she expected, and by the time she'd crossed half the lobby, one of his men had already noticed her and shifted his body slightly to block her path. "Wait," she said, louder than she meant to, and Garrison's head turned toward the sound. His eyes found her instantly, and something in his expression sharpened the moment he recognized her. The sweatshirt, the messy hair, the same careful nothing face she'd worn in her father's living room. "It's fine," Garrison said to his man, waving him back with 2 fingers, and the man stepped aside without argument. Penelope closed the remaining distance and held out the envelope, her hand not quite steady. "Please," she said quietly, "just take this. You don't have to read it here." Instead of taking the envelope, Garrison caught her wrist. It wasn't rough. If anything, his grip was careful, deliberate, the kind of hold that communicated control rather than force. But it was enough to stop her cold, her pulse suddenly loud in her own ears, the envelope still pinched between her fingers. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't a request so much as a statement of what was about to happen. He guided her toward a private elevator tucked behind the main bank, one that required a keycard his man produced without being asked. The doors slid shut, sealing them into a small, mirrored space that smelled like cedar and something clean and expensive she couldn't name. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You've been avoiding me since your father's living room," Garrison said finally, his eyes on her rather than the numbers climbing above the door. "And now you're chasing me down in a hotel lobby with a letter you didn't want anyone to see you deliver." "It's not what you think," Penelope started. "I already know what it is." He held out his hand, and this time she gave him the envelope. He didn't open it. He simply held it, turning it once between his fingers like he already understood everything written inside. "Your father is trying to sell me a piece of property he doesn't own, using a deed his contact in the county office forged for him. Riverside lot, tied up in a probate case that won't clear for another year." Penelope stared at him, the careful speech she'd rehearsed the night before evaporating completely. "You already know." "I've known for 2 days," Garrison said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of tired patience, like a man who'd caught this exact play many times before and found it more exhausting than infuriating. "I don't sign anything without having it checked 6 ways before the ink dries. Your father isn't the first person foolish enough to try this on me. He won't be the last." "Then why haven't you—" She stopped herself before finishing the question, unsure she wanted the answer. "Why haven't I already ruined him?" Garrison finished for her, and something almost gentle crossed his expression. "Because I was curious what his daughter would do about it." The elevator slowed, then stopped, though the doors stayed closed.
Penelope realized he must have held it there deliberately, buying them privacy she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she wanted. "You didn't have to come warn me," he said. "You could have stayed quiet and let this play out without involving yourself at all. Instead, you tracked my schedule, wrote a letter, and walked into a building full of my men to hand-deliver it yourself." "He's still my father," Penelope said, her voice quieter now. "Whatever he's done, whatever he's planning, I couldn't just let it happen without saying something." Garrison studied her for a long moment, the same searching look he'd given her across the coffee table 2 days earlier, except this time she didn't look away. There didn't seem to be much point in hiding anymore, not after what she'd just done. "You don't need the sweatshirt around me," he said finally, his voice lower now, almost private. "Or the messy hair, or whatever else you're doing to make people overlook you. I already see exactly what you're trying to hide, Penelope." Her breath caught at the sound of her own name in his voice, a name she was fairly certain she'd never told him. "I know your father's associates," he said simply, answering the question before she could ask it. "I've known who you are since the moment I saw your face in that living room. What I didn't know, until just now, was whether you'd stand there and let your father destroy himself, or whether you'd do something about it." The elevator doors slid open on an empty floor, and Garrison stepped back to let her exit first, the envelope still unopened in his hand. "You've made your choice clear enough," he said. "Now I need to make sure Broderick's men don't make one for you." Penelope hadn't expected to leave the Grand Plaza in a car that wasn't her own, sitting in the back seat of a black sedan while Garrison spoke in low, clipped sentences into his phone, giving instructions to someone she couldn't see. She'd handed over a letter meant to protect her father, and somehow, in the span of 20 minutes, found herself pulled entirely into a world she'd spent 3 years trying to stay invisible from. "Your building," Garrison said, ending the call and turning to look at her properly for the first time since they'd left the hotel. "Is anyone home right now? Your father?" "He had a meeting downtown. He won't be back until tonight." Penelope's stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because Broderick has men watching your street." Garrison's voice stayed level, but something in his jaw had shifted, tightened in a way she hadn't seen before. "He's been tracking your father's movements for a week, probably longer, and the moment he realizes the deed's been exposed, you become the easiest piece of leverage he has left to salvage anything from this deal." Penelope felt the blood drain slightly from her face. "Leverage." "He can't hurt Silas without losing whatever debt he's owed, but you're a different story. A daughter goes missing for a few hours, a phone call gets made, and suddenly your father's very motivated to cover Broderick's losses himself." Garrison said it plainly, without softening it, and somehow that made it worse than if he'd tried to comfort her. "It's not going to happen. But we're not taking you home either. Not today." The car didn't turn toward her neighborhood. It merged onto the highway instead, heading away from the city, past the last cluster of office towers and into wide stretches of trees and open sky that Penelope had never had much reason to drive through. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere secure." Garrison glanced at his phone once more, reading something, then set it face down on the seat between them, his full attention returning to her. "My estate. You'll be safe there while my people handle the situation with Broderick, and your father sorts out what to do about the deed." "You can't just—" Penelope started, then stopped, unsure exactly how to finish that sentence. She'd walked into the hotel that morning, intending to hand over a letter and disappear. She hadn't planned on being taken anywhere, hadn't planned on any of this. "I can, actually," Garrison said, not unkindly. "And given the alternative involves men who wouldn't think twice about grabbing you off your own front porch, I'd suggest you let me." She didn't have a good argument against that. She sat back against the seat and watched the trees blur past the window, her mind circling through everything that had happened in the last few hours until it all blended into a single, exhausting knot. The estate, when they finally reached it, was nothing like she'd expected. She'd pictured something cold and fortress-like, high walls and security cameras on every corner, and there were certainly gates and guards at the entrance, But beyond them, the house itself sat surrounded by gardens, ivy climbing one side of the stone exterior, warm light glowing from tall windows despite the late afternoon hour. It looked less like the home of a man people feared and more like something out of an old photograph, quiet and settled, built to last generations rather than impress visitors. A woman met them at the door, introduced simply as Marta, who ran the household with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd worked there a long time and had long since stopped being surprised by anything Garrison brought home. She led Penelope up a wide staircase to a guest room that overlooked the back gardens, and within the hour, a small selection of clothing had appeared on the bed, tags still attached, sized correctly, without Penelope ever being asked her measurements.
"Mr. Blackwood thought you might want something of your own to wear," Marta said, setting a second bag down beside the first, "rather than staying in what you arrived in." Penelope looked at the clothes for a long moment after Marta left. A soft gray sweater dress, dark jeans that actually fit through the waist and hips instead of hanging shapeless the way everything in her closet at home did, a simple cream blouse with a neckline that sat where it was supposed to, rather than swallowing her frame in fabric. She hadn't worn anything like this in 3 years. She'd forgotten, almost, what it felt like to put on clothes chosen for how they looked rather than how well they helped her disappear. She changed slowly, some old instinct resisting the whole time, a quiet voice reminding her that visibility meant risk, that the sweatshirt had kept her safe for 3 years, and she had no business abandoning that now, in a stranger's house, no matter how secure the gates outside claimed to be. But she was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of the weight of pretending. At least for one evening, in a house where the only person who mattered already knew exactly who she was. She came down the staircase a half-hour later in the sweater dress, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual messy knot, and found Garrison standing near the tall windows of the front sitting room, a glass of something amber in his hand that he hadn't yet touched. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, and whatever he'd been about to say seemed to leave him entirely. Penelope felt her face warm under the sudden, complete stillness of his attention. It wasn't like the searching look he'd given her in her father's living room, trying to place a memory. This was something else, simpler and somehow more overwhelming. A man looking at a woman and forgetting, for a moment, to guard his own expression. "You look," he started, then stopped himself, setting the glass down on a side table without drinking from it. He recovered quickly, his voice settling back into its usual measured calm, though something warmer lingered underneath it. "I hope the room's comfortable. Marta will have dinner ready shortly if you're hungry." It wasn't what he'd meant to say, and Penelope suspected they both knew it. But he didn't push further, didn't let his eyes linger too long, or make her feel like an object on display in a room she hadn't chosen to be in. He simply gestured toward the dining room, professional and steady again, and Penelope found herself grateful for it, even as some small, unfamiliar part of her wished, just slightly, that he'd finished the sentence. Dinner that first night had been quieter than Penelope expected. Mostly small talk about the house, about Marta's cooking, careful conversation that avoided anything to do with her father or Broderick, or the letter still sitting unopened somewhere in Garrison's study. But by the second day, the careful distance between them had started to soften into something easier. She found him in the gardens on the morning of the 4th day, standing near a row of climbing roses that hadn't quite finished blooming, his sleeves rolled up despite the cool air, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. "I didn't take you for a gardener," Penelope said, coming to stand beside him. "I'm not. My grandmother was." Garrison glanced at the roses without quite looking at her. "She planted most of what's out here before I was born. I kept the gardener on after she passed because it felt wrong to let it go to waste, even though I couldn't tell you the difference between half these plants." It was the first personal thing he'd offered her since she'd arrived, and Penelope found herself surprised by how much she wanted to hear more. "What was she like?" "Stubborn."
A faint, genuine smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. She ran this house like her own small kingdom. Didn't care much who my father did business with, as long as they took their shoes off at the front door. Penelope laughed, a real laugh, the first one she'd let herself have in days, and Garrison looked at her then, properly, like the sound had caught him off guard in some way he hadn't expected.
They fell into a routine over the next 2 days that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both seemed to settle into easily. Mornings in the garden, Garrison working through calls and messages, while Penelope wandered the paths between the roses and the old stone fountain at the center, occasionally reading from a worn paperback she'd found in the estate's library. Afternoons in that same library, an enormous room lined floor to ceiling with books that looked like they'd been collected across several generations, rather than bought all at once for show. Penelope had never seen so many books outside a public library, and Garrison, watching her run her fingers along the spines with something close to reverence, seemed genuinely pleased by her reaction.
"You can borrow anything you want," he told her, settling into the armchair across from hers with a folder of papers he barely glanced at. "Most of these haven't been opened in years."
"That seems like a waste."
"It is." He set the folder aside entirely, giving up any pretense of working. "I don't read as much as I should. Never seem to have the time."
"Powerful men rarely do,"
Penelope said, and immediately wondered if that had come out sharper than she meant. But Garrison only huffed, something between a laugh and an acknowledgement. "You'd be surprised how much of my time gets spent doing things I have no interest in at all. Meetings, negotiations, making sure men like your father's associate don't decide violence is a reasonable business strategy." He glanced at her. "None of it particularly rewarding. This," he gestured vaguely between them, the quiet room, the stack of books, "is the first genuinely pleasant afternoon I've had in longer than I want to admit." Penelope felt something warm settle in her chest at that, though she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. She'd spent 3 years assuming men in Garrison's line of work were incapable of this, of quiet afternoons and honest conversation, of anything beyond calculated moves and careful threats. He'd shown her nothing but patience since the moment she'd handed him that letter in the hotel lobby, and it was becoming harder by the day to reconcile that patience with the reputation that made grown men go quiet the moment his name entered a conversation. It was on the 5th evening, as they sat together near the fireplace in the smaller sitting room, that Garrison finally told her the rest of it. "I kept something," he said, apropos of nothing, setting his glass down and reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. "For 3 years now. I never told you the whole story of what happened after you helped me." He held out a small folded square of fabric, and Penelope's breath caught the moment she recognized it. Pale blue, a small embroidered flower stitched into one corner, slightly faded now, but unmistakably hers. "You kept it," she said quietly, taking it from him with careful hands, running her thumb over the stitching she remembered doing herself years ago in a college dorm room during a particularly boring lecture. "I went back to your building twice, hoping to find you again. Nobody at the front desk would tell me anything."
Garrison's voice had lost its usual measured calm, something rawer underneath it now.
"I told myself eventually I'd stop looking. I never quite managed it."
"I thought about you too," Penelope admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I wondered if you made it to a hospital, if the wound healed properly. I never found out."
"It healed fine. Left a scar, but fine."
He reached out, hesitated for a moment like he wasn't certain the gesture would be welcome, then gently closed her fingers around the handkerchief.
"You saved my life that night, and didn't ask for anything in return. I've spent 3 years wanting to properly thank the woman who did that."
"You don't have to thank me."
"I'm not doing it because I have to."
His eyes held hers, steady, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before.
"I'm doing it because I want to."
The fire crackled between them,
And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The silence, comfortable rather than heavy, filled with everything neither of them was quite ready to say out loud yet. Penelope looked down at the small piece of fabric in her hands. 3 years old, and still carefully kept, and understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever this was building into between them, it had already stopped being simple gratitude a long time ago. The boardroom on the top floor of Garrison's downtown office occupied the entire west wing, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, a long table of dark polished wood surrounded by the 6 men who made up the inner circle of his operation. Penelope had never been inside this building before, let alone this room, and she felt every set of eyes shift toward her the moment Garrison led her through the door.
"This isn't standard practice," said a heavy-set man near the far end of the table, his voice carrying the kind of blunt authority that suggested he'd earned the right to speak plainly in front of his boss. Vincent, Garrison had told her earlier, his second in command, a man who'd been with the operation since before Garrison had taken full control of it. "Bringing her in here. She's involved," Garrison said simply, pulling out a chair for Penelope near the head of the table before taking his own seat. "That makes this relevant to her." "With respect," Vincent continued, glancing at Penelope with an expression that wasn't unkind but wasn't particularly warm either. "Her father tried to sell you a fake deed. In most circumstances, that's the kind of thing that ends business relationships permanently, and not gently. The fact that we're sitting here discussing options instead of already having handled it plainly is unusual enough. Having his daughter present for the conversation is more unusual still." "Silas Vance is a separate issue from his daughter," Garrison said, his tone even but carrying an edge that made it clear the subject wasn't fully open for debate. "I've made my position on that clear already." "Your position doesn't erase the risk," another man added, younger than Vincent, sharper-featured. "If word gets out that Blackwood let a forged deed slide because of a personal connection, every small operator in this city starts wondering what else they can get away with." Penelope felt her face heat under the weight of the conversation happening around her rather than with her, but she made herself sit straight, made herself listen rather than shrink the way 3 years of practiced invisibility had trained her to do. This was exactly the kind of room she'd spent years learning to disappear inside of. She forced herself to stay present instead. "I'm not asking anyone to pretend nothing happened," Garrison said. "Silas will answer for what he did. But there's more to this than a single forged deed, and before any of you decide what consequences look like, I think you should hear what Penelope found." All eyes shifted toward her again, and this time Penelope met them directly instead of looking away. "My father didn't act alone," she said, opening the folder she'd been holding since they'd left the estate that morning, a set of ledgers she'd spent the better part of 2 days poring over in Garrison's library, cross-referencing figures against public property records Garrison's people had pulled for her. "Broderick's been funneling money through 3 shell accounts registered under construction firms that don't actually build anything. My father's debt to him isn't just gambling losses, it's payment for helping launder a portion of Broderick's income through fake real estate transactions, the Riverside deed being one piece of a larger pattern." She slid copies of the ledger pages across the table, watching as Vincent's skeptical expression shifted, slowly, into something closer to genuine interest. "These 3 properties," Penelope continued, pointing to a column of figures she'd highlighted the night before, "were all sold and resold within 18 months, each time at a loss on paper, but with cash payments that don't match the recorded sale price. That's not bad business. That's structured to hide money moving somewhere it shouldn't be." "How did you find this?" Vincent asked, and there was no condescension left in his voice at all. "I used to help my father with his bookkeeping before I understood what I was actually looking at," Penelope said. "I know how the numbers are supposed to look. These didn't." Garrison sat back slightly, watching the reactions around the table with an expression Penelope couldn't quite read, though there was something like quiet pride in it. "Broderick isn't just a rival trying to steal one deal out from under me," he said, addressing the room now. "He's been building a laundering operation, using small, desperate men like Silas Vance to do it. Men who won't ask questions because they can't afford to. That's a bigger problem than a single fake property, and it's one worth handling properly rather than reacting to with something that just makes more of a mess." "And Silas?" the sharper-featured man asked. "Silas gets separated from Broderick entirely," Garrison said,
Cleanly, without bloodshed, without giving Broderick's people any excuse to retaliate against him or his daughter. We use what Penelope found to freeze the accounts Broderick's been hiding money in, legally, quietly, in a way that leaves him with nothing to come after us over. Vincent studied the ledger pages a moment longer, then looked up at Penelope with something that had shifted, fully now, into respect. "This is good work," he said simply. "Better than most of what my own people bring me." Penelope felt a small, surprised warmth at that, unused to praise from anyone outside her own small circle, let alone from a man who'd questioned her presence in the room only minutes before. After the meeting broke and the others filed out, Garrison lingered behind, watching her gather the folder back together with careful hands. "You didn't have to do any of that," he said quietly once they were alone. "I could have handled Broderick without dragging you into a boardroom full of my people." "I wanted to help," Penelope said. "And I think I just proved I'm not only useful for warning letters." Something shifted in Garrison's expression, warm and unguarded in a way she was starting to recognize as entirely genuine. "You proved a great deal more than that," he said. "Vincent doesn't hand out compliments easily. He's been with me 11 years, and I've watched him tear apart proposals from men with financial degrees twice over." "So I impressed the intimidating one." "You impressed all of them," Garrison said, "including me, though I suspect I was already there before this morning." The abandoned metro station hub sat 3 blocks from the old rail yard, a relic from a transit expansion that had been cancelled decades ago, its tiled corridors and empty platforms left to gather dust rather than ever seeing use. Garrison had chosen it deliberately, Penelope realized, as their car pulled up outside the boarded entrance. Neutral ground, private enough that no one would witness what happened here, but abandoned enough that it carried its own quiet message about how thoroughly Broderick's ambitions had already failed. "You don't have to come inside," Garrison said, one hand resting briefly on the car door before opening it. "I can have Dennis take you back to the estate." "I want to be there," Penelope said. "This involves my father, too." Garrison studied her for a moment, then nodded, something like respect in the gesture rather than reluctance. "Stay close to me. Whatever happens in there, let me handle it." Inside, the station had been cleaned up just enough for the meeting, portable lights strung along one wall to cut through the gloom, a folding table set up near the old ticket booths with several of Garrison's men positioned at a respectful distance. Her father was already there when they arrived, standing beside Broderick Vance, a tall, narrow man with a permanently unimpressed expression that Penelope had seen exactly twice before in her life, both times when her father had brought business associates through the house late at night. Silas's face went through several emotions at once when he saw Penelope walk in beside Garrison. Confusion first, then something closer to fear, though whether it was fear for her or fear of what her presence meant for him, Penelope genuinely couldn't tell. "Penelope," her father said carefully, "what are you doing here?" "Making sure this gets handled properly," Garrison answered for her, his voice carrying easily across the empty station. "Since your daughter is the one who uncovered exactly how deep this arrangement between the two of you actually runs." Broderick's expression flickered, the first real crack in his composure. "I don't know what you think you found, Blackwood, but 3 shell accounts registered to construction firms that don't build anything," Garrison said, cutting him off without raising his voice. 18 months of property sales, structured to move money that shouldn't have been moving at all, with Silas here providing the paperwork trail to make it look legitimate. Riverside was just the piece that got sloppy enough to notice. Silas's face had gone pale. "Penelope, did you?" "I found your ledgers, Dad," she said quietly. "I know what you've been doing. I know why." "It doesn't matter what she found," Broderick said, stepping forward, his voice sharpening. "None of it proves anything that would hold up." "It doesn't need to hold up in a courtroom," Garrison said. "It only needs to hold up long enough for me to make a few phone calls." He nodded toward one of his men, who stepped forward and handed a folder to Broderick. Thin, precise, the kind of document that clearly wasn't meant to be argued with. "Those 3 accounts were frozen this morning, legally,
through channels that trace back to nothing you can point to as retaliation. Every dollar you moved through Silas's fake sales is locked until a very thorough audit clears it, which, given what's actually in those accounts, I doubt it ever will. Broderick opened the folder, his jaw tightening as he scanned the pages, and for the first time since Penelope had entered the station, he looked less like a man in control of the room and more like one watching an entire operation collapse in front of him without a single shot being fired to cause it. "This is theft," Broderick said, though the words came out with less conviction than he clearly intended. "It's a legal freeze on funds tied to a documented fraud pattern," Garrison said calmly. "You're welcome to challenge it through proper channels, though I suspect that would draw more attention to those accounts than you'd like. Or you can walk away from this quietly, the way men usually do when they've been caught with nowhere left to run." Broderick's eyes moved from Garrison to Penelope, lingering there with something cold and assessing that made her stomach tighten, though Garrison shifted slightly, just enough to place himself partly between them without making it obvious he was doing so.
"This isn't finished," Broderick said, but the threat had no real weight behind it anymore, and everyone in the room seemed to know it.
"It is, actually," Garrison said, "because if I hear you've come anywhere near Silas, his daughter, or anyone connected to this family again, the accounts won't be the only thing I freeze." He let that sit for a moment, quiet and absolute. "Walk away, Broderick. This is the only version of today that ends without you losing considerably more than money." Broderick held his gaze a moment longer, then turned without another word and walked toward the far exit, his own men falling into step behind him, leaving the station considerably quieter than before. Silas stood alone now, the folder of frozen assets meaning nothing to him directly, but the weight of everything else settling visibly onto his shoulders. "Penelope," he started.
"You put me in danger,"
she said before he could find whatever excuse he'd been reaching for.
"You were going to let me become leverage in a debt you created."
"I didn't think it would go that far."
"That's not good enough, Dad."
Her voice shook slightly, though she kept it steady enough to finish.
"I love you. I'll always love you. But I can't keep living in a house where I have to disguise myself just to stay safe from the people you do business with."
Garrison stepped forward then, producing a second document from inside his jacket, sliding it across the folding table toward Silas. "This severs any financial ties between your household and my operation, effective immediately. It also formally removes Penelope from any liability tied to your debts, past or future. Sign it, and whatever happens with your finances going forward is entirely separate from her." Silas looked down at the document for a long moment, then up at his daughter, seeing something in her expression, perhaps, that made further argument feel pointless. He picked up the pen one of Garrison's men offered him and signed without another word. "I'm sorry," he said quietly once it was done. "For all of it." Penelope didn't answer right away. There would be time later, she thought, to figure out what her relationship with her father looked like now, whether it could be rebuilt at all. But standing in that abandoned station, the weight of 3 years of hiding finally lifted off her shoulders. She found she didn't need to answer him immediately. Garrison's hand found hers, steady and warm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Penelope let herself simply breathe. The rooftop terrace sat above Garrison's downtown building, a private space accessible only through his own office, far removed from the noise of the city below, despite being surrounded by it on every side. String lights hung along the edges of the space, though the sun hadn't fully set yet, the sky over the harbor turning a deep gold that spilled across the tiled floor and caught in Penelope's hair as she stepped out through the glass doors. "You've been quiet all day," Garrison said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, the city stretched out below them in every direction. "I've been thinking," Penelope admitted, "about everything. My father, what happens now?" It had been a week since the station, since Silas had signed the document severing their financial ties,
since Broderick had disappeared from her life as completely as if he'd never existed at all. Her father had moved out of the house shortly after, taking a smaller apartment across town, the two of them speaking only occasionally, carefully, both still learning what their relationship looked like now that the danger had been removed from it. It wasn't healed. Penelope wasn't certain it ever fully would be, but it was honest now, in a way it hadn't been in years, and that felt like something worth holding on to. "He asked about you yesterday," Garrison said. "Wanted to know if you were doing well."
"What did you tell him?"
"That you were the most capable person I'd ever brought into a boardroom, and that he was fortunate you still answered his calls at all." A faint smile crossed his face. "Both true as far as I'm concerned." Penelope laughed softly, leaning against the railing, watching the last of the daylight catch against the glass towers across the harbor. She thought about the woman she'd been a week ago, oversized sweatshirt and messy hair, moving through rooms trying to take up as little space as possible. That woman felt distant now, like someone she'd read about rather than someone she'd actually been. "Can I ask you something?" she said.
"Anything."
"That first day, in my father's living room, you asked if we'd met." She turned to look at him properly. "Would you have let it go if I hadn't come to warn you about the deed? If I just kept hiding?" Garrison considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things, without rushing toward an easy answer. "No," he said finally. "I'd already decided I was going to find out who you were, one way or another. I'd spent 3 years looking for the woman who patched up my arm in that lobby. I wasn't about to let her disappear again after finally finding her, whether she came to me or not." "That's either very romantic or slightly alarming," Penelope said, though there was no real edge to it. "Probably both," Garrison admitted. "I've never claimed to be an entirely reasonable man where you're concerned." He reached into his jacket then, and for a moment Penelope thought he might be reaching for the handkerchief again, some further sentimental gesture tied to the past they shared. Instead, he produced something smaller, a slim velvet box that he held out to her without ceremony, without kneeling, without any of the performance she might have expected from a man of his position. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight," he said, before she could fully process what she was looking at. "I know that would be moving too fast, even after everything, but I wanted you to have this, because I meant what I said in that living room a week ago. You don't have to hide from anything, not anymore. Not from your father's world, not from mine, and certainly not from me." Penelope opened the box with careful hands and found not a ring as she'd half expected, but a small pendant, silver, shaped delicately like the flower embroidered on the handkerchief she still kept folded in her nightstand drawer. "I had it made after the station," Garrison said. "I wanted something that meant the beginning of this, not just the reminder of how it started 3 years ago." "It's beautiful," Penelope said, her voice thick with something she hadn't expected to feel this strongly, standing on a rooftop with the whole city spread out gold and glowing beneath them. "I meant what I asked you that first day, in a different way than you probably realized at the time," Garrison said, taking the pendant from the box and stepping closer, fastening it carefully around her neck, his fingers brushing the back of her neck with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with everything the world believed about him. "I asked if we'd met because some part of me already knew the answer. I'm asking something different now. Stay with me. Not as someone hiding in my house because it isn't safe anywhere else. Stay because you want to be here, exactly as you are, without a single part of yourself dimmed down for anyone's comfort." Penelope looked up at him, the pendant settling cool and light against her collarbone, and felt the last remnants of 3 years spent trying to be invisible, finally, fully, let go. "I spent so long thinking that being seen was dangerous," she said quietly, "that the safest version of me was the one nobody noticed at all. And now? Now I think I was just waiting for someone worth being seen by." She reached up, resting her hand against his jaw, feeling him go still beneath her touch the same way he had that very first day, watching her across her father's living room, like he'd already recognized something in her that she hadn't yet found in herself. "Yes, I'll stay." Garrison's expression broke into something Penelope hadn't seen from him before, unguarded and entirely open. All the careful control he carried through every boardroom and negotiation dissolving into something simpler, something that looked, more than anything else, like relief. He kissed her then, softly, the city lights beginning to flicker on below them one by one as the sky deepened toward evening. And Penelope thought, standing there in a place she never could have imagined for herself a week earlier, that this was what it felt like to finally stop hiding. Not the absence of danger, though that mattered too, but the presence of someone who had looked at her, disguise and all, and seen exactly who she was from the very first moment. 3 years after a stranger had bandaged a wound in the rain and vanished into the night, Penelope Vance stood on a rooftop above the city, no longer hiding, no longer invisible, finally, completely herself, beside the one person who had never once needed her to be anything else.